Somewhere on Earth, 70,000 years ago, there may have been fewer human beings alive than fill the seats of a single stadium. Not a nation, not a city, not even a town. A number so small that today we wouldn't call it a population. We'd call it a rounding error. And yet, from that fragile handful of survivors came every person who has ever lived since. Every language, every civilization, every war, every love story, every name carved into stone or spoken into memory. All of it hanging by a thread so thin that scientists, staring at human DNA, still find it hard to believe it held. Something happened to our species. Something almost erased us before our story had truly begun. And the answer may be buried in a lake most people have never heard of. For most of human history, we've told ourselves a comforting story. But we climbed steadily upward, from stone tools to cities, from cities to civilizations, an unbroken line of progress. But that story has a crack in it, a silence in our genetic code that shouldn't be there. Here is the problem. Compare human DNA to that of chimpanzees, and something strange emerges. A single group of chimps living in one forest in West Africa carries more genetic variation among themselves than the entire human race does, spread across 7 continents and 8 billion people. For a species this widespread, this dominant, this successful, that number makes no sense. Unless, at some point, almost all of us died. Something pushed humanity through a doorway so narrow that only a handful made it to the other side. And when scientists went looking for what that something might have been, they found a crater in Indonesia large enough to swallow a sea. Today, Lake Toba looks peaceful. Turquoise water, green hills, a place where tourists come to relax. But this lake is not what it appears to be. It is a wound, a scar left behind by one of the most violent events our planet has ever produced.
Roughly 74,000 years ago, something detonated at this location with a force that is almost impossible for the human mind to picture. Think of Mount St. Helens, the eruption that reshaped an entire American landscape in 1980. Now multiply that violence by a factor of thousands. Toba didn't erupt so much as it ruptured. An estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of rock, ash, and pulverized earth were hurled into the sky in a single catastrophic event. Enough material to bury a small country meters deep. The devastation reached farther than anyone expected. Ash from Toba has been found in India, more than 2,000 kilometers away, sealed into ancient soil in layers thick enough that geologists can still read them today. A fossilized snapshot of the worst day this region had ever seen. But here is the twist. The explosion itself may not have been the true killer. What came after was worse. When a volcano erupts on this scale, it doesn't just throw rock into the air. It injects enormous quantities of sulfur high into the stratosphere, far above ordinary weather. There, that sulfur combines with water vapor to form a fine haze. A haze that can wrap itself around the entire planet, reflecting sunlight back into space before it ever reaches the ground. The planet, in effect, begins to lose its light. Scientists drilling into the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, frozen archives that preserve a chemical diary of Earth's ancient atmosphere, found something chilling. A sulfate signature dated to precisely this period. locked in ice for 70,000 years, waiting. What followed, researchers believe, was a volcanic winter. Global temperatures may have dropped several degrees on average, and in some regions, the plunge would have been far more brutal, lasting not weeks, but years. Forests that once fed entire communities may have thinned and died. Grasslands that herds depended on may have withered beneath layers of ash.
Rain. The invisible rhythm that decides whether rivers run full or crops of wild grain survive at all may have failed across multiple continents at once. This wasn't a bad season. This may have been a bad decade. Now picture the people living through it. There were no cities yet, no writing, no agriculture. Just small bands of hunter-gatherers scattered across Africa and pushing, in places, into Asia. They understood fire. They shaped stone tools with growing skill. Some had already begun to leave behind the first fragile traces of symbolic thought. Deliberate burials, engraved pigment, the earliest whisper of meaning beyond survival. But none of them knew a mountain had torn itself apart on the other side of the world. None of them understood why the sky had changed color, why the sun felt weaker, why a cold that had never come before was suddenly refusing to leave. They only knew that surviving, already difficult on a good day, had become almost impossible. Walk with them for a moment. A small group moves across a landscape that used to feed them. The animals they once tracked have vanished, driven off by dying vegetation, or dead from starvation themselves. The plants they once gathered are stunted or buried beneath a fine gray powder that coats every leaf. The water tastes different now. Bitter, mineral, wrong. Children weaken first. The old and the sick follow. There's no way for them to know it's a volcano's fault. No way to know it will ever end. There is only the immediate, merciless arithmetic of survival. Find food. Find water. Find shelter from a cold with no explanation. And, as far as they could tell, no end in sight. This idea has a name in scientific circles, the Toba catastrophe hypothesis. Proposed in the 1990s by geologist Michael Rampino and anthropologist Stanley Ambrose, it made a bold claim that this single eruption triggered a population collapse severe enough to leave its fingerprint on human DNA to this day. Some estimates arising from the theory suggested the entire surviving population of Homo sapiens may have fallen to somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 breeding individuals. Sit with that number for a second. Fewer people than live in a small town today. Not gathered together, but scattered, isolated pockets across an entire continent, each group likely unaware that anyone else like them still existed anywhere else on Earth. If the hypothesis is correct, every human alive right now, every one of the 8 billion people on this planet, descends from that narrow, fragile population. Every ethnicity, every culture, every language ever spoken, all of it funneled through a genetic bottleneck so tight it very nearly sealed shut for good. For years, this theory dominated the conversation about our species' deep past. It was dramatic, it was tidy, it offered a satisfying explanation for a genuine genetic mystery. But real science doesn't stop at the satisfying answer. It keeps digging. And what researchers found next complicated everything. Archaeologists began excavating beneath the actual layer of Toba ash.
literally digging through the moment of catastrophe itself, comparing what human life looked like just before the eruption to what it looked like just after. What they uncovered at sites like Pinnacle Point in South Africa was unexpected. Stone tools, evidence of continuous habitation both underneath and above the ash layer. People had not vanished from this place. They had endured in the same location straight through the disaster. This doesn't erase the catastrophe, but it does dismantle the image of a single, simultaneous apocalypse sweeping the entire species off the map at once. Instead, a more complicated, and in some ways more human picture has begun to emerge. One where different groups in different places faced completely different fates. Some communities, perhaps living along coastlines with access to shellfish and marine resources, may have weathered the crisis far better than expected. Coastal environments tend to stay more stable than inland grasslands, even during severe climate shocks, and a reliable food source that doesn't depend on rainfall could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Other populations, especially those depending entirely on inland ecosystems, may have suffered catastrophic losses. In some regions, entire lineages may have vanished completely. So the story of Toba may not be one apocalypse. It may be dozens of separate stories playing out at once across a single continent. Survival here, collapse there, silence somewhere else entirely. And there is something quietly devastating hidden in that detail. Not every group made it. The ancestors we descended from weren't necessarily the strongest, or the smartest, or the most advanced. In many cases, they may simply have been the luckiest, standing by chance in the right place near the right resources when the sky went dark. But the story doesn't end there, because even the ice core evidence, the very foundation the original theory was built on, is now being questioned. Some newer studies suggest the global cooling triggered by Toba, while very real, may have been shorter and less extreme than first believed. A severe volcanic winter, perhaps, but not necessarily the multi-decade deep freeze early researchers imagined. Other scientists push back, arguing that even a shorter global cooling could have devastated specific, already vulnerable populations living on the margins of survival. This is where honest science gets uncomfortable, and where it becomes deeply human. There is no single, perfect answer waiting to be uncovered. There are overlapping fragments of evidence: ice cores, ash layers, buried tools, and the genetic code carried inside every living person, each one telling a slightly different version of the same distant story. Piecing it together isn't like reading a finished book. It's like reconstructing a shattered one, page by scattered page, from fragments found on opposite sides of the world. But here is what almost everyone agrees on. Something happened to the human population around this time. The genetic bottleneck is real, whether or not Toba alone caused it. Some researchers now believe the eruption may have been one severe stressor layered on top of others: shifting sea levels, existing climate instability, and the ordinary, brutal unpredictability that came with being a small, scattered species with no buffer against bad luck. In other words, humanity may not have been pushed to the edge in a single catastrophic night. It may have been a slow tightening. A species already living close to the margins, squeezed further and further by a crisis it could never have understood. And still, we survived. This, more than the eruption, more than the ash, more than even the bottleneck itself, is the most extraordinary part of the entire story. Somewhere, scattered across Africa in small, isolated pockets, groups of humans held on. They found water when the rivers ran strange. They found food when the old sources disappeared. They passed knowledge from one generation to the next, how to start a fire, how to track a wounded animal, how to tell a plant that heals from one that kills. Through a crisis none of them could have named, let alone understood. They had no science, no warning, no way of knowing the sky would ever clear again. They simply endured, day by day, choice by choice, life by life. And from that narrow, fragile thread of survivors, every person watching this right now descends. Every civilization that would ever rise.
Every pyramid, every cathedral, every symphony, every rocket ever launched into space, all of it traces back to a small number of people who refused to give up in the middle of a global winter they could not explain. There is a strange kind of humility hidden in this knowledge. We like to picture human history as a triumphant march, from cave to city, from stone tool to spacecraft. But this story suggests something far more fragile sits beneath all of it. Chance, endurance, a stubborn refusal to stop, even when stopping would have been so much easier. The questions haven't stopped either. Researchers today are using genome sequencing to search for the genetic echoes of ancient population crashes, not just from Toba, but from the broader pattern of pressure our ancestors faced again and again throughout deep prehistory. Volcanologists continue to study Toba and other supervolcanoes like it, trying to understand what an eruption of this scale would mean if it happened again in the modern world. Because Toba was not unique. It was simply the largest eruption of its kind that we know of, and similar systems exist today, dormant beneath places like Yellowstone in the United States, quietly capable, one day, of producing something comparable. This isn't a warning about the end of the world. Eruptions on this scale are exceptionally rare, occurring at most once every 100,000 years or so. But it is a reminder that the same planet that gave rise to us is also capable of turning against us without warning, without malice, simply through its own restless geology. What Toba ultimately leaves us with isn't fear. It's something closer to awe. It shows us how thin the line really is between a thriving population and near total collapse. It shows us that survival was never guaranteed by intelligence or technology alone, that circumstance, adaptability, and sheer stubborn will played just as large a role. And it shows us something quietly profound, that despite ash-darkened skies, despite failing food, despite years of cold that must have felt endless, our ancestors did not simply survive as broken remnants scattered across a ruined continent. They rebuilt. They expanded. In the tens of thousands of years that followed, they migrated out of Africa in successive waves, eventually reaching every habitable landmass on Earth. They developed increasingly sophisticated tools, symbolic art, complex language, and eventually, agriculture,
writing, and civilization itself. From a population that may have numbered only a few thousand people, humanity didn't just recover. It went on to become the most dominant species this planet has ever produced. Today, nearly 8 billion of us stand where a handful once stood.
We've split the atom, mapped our own genome, sent machines beyond the edge of the solar system. And every achievement, every failure, every ordinary life lived in between traces back to that same fragile thread. Survivors of a crisis they never lived long enough to understand. Lake Toba still exists. Its waters are calm now, its violence long silenced, transformed into one of the most beautiful landscapes in Indonesia. Communities live along its shores today. Tourists visit to admire its size, most never realizing the true weight of what happened here in the deep, distant past. Long before the first word was ever written down. But beneath that calm water, in ash layers still found in soil thousands of kilometers away, and in the genetic code carried inside every human body on Earth, the memory of that ancient crisis remains. A silent, permanent record of the moment our entire species nearly ceased to exist. Perhaps that is the real lesson Toba leaves behind. Not a warning about volcanoes, not a curiosity about ancient genetics, but a deeper truth about what it actually means to be human. We are not the guaranteed outcome of some cosmic plan. We are the descendants of survivors, ordinary people facing an extraordinary crisis, who kept going when giving up would have been so much easier. Every person who has ever lived, loved, built, or dreamed exists because 70,000 years ago, in the ash-choked aftermath of the largest volcanic eruption in 2.5 million years, a small, fragile population of human beings refused to disappear. And in the end, that may be the truest definition of what it means to be human at all. Not our tools, not our technology, not even our intelligence. Our extraordinary, almost unreasonable capacity to endure.